Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to have you join us today for this webinar on the ongoing competition in the Arctic. I'd also like to offer a special ACIR welcome to two members of our Consular Corps, Young-Jun Kim, the Consul General of Korea, and John Parkerson, Honorary Consul General from Hungary. And of course, a great big welcome and thanks to Professor Tom Rotnem for speaking to us today about thrills, chills, and spills, developments in the Russian Arctic. Or perhaps put another way, the new great game now playing in the Arctic. With the melting of the Arctic ice, there now is an ever increasing interest in the potential wealth and resources, as well as opportunities for openings in the Arctic that the region may offer. 8 nations, as many of you know, have territory that bounds the region: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and of course the United States through Alaska. Technological advances in extracting natural resources, including fish, rare earth minerals, oil, and gas, as well as other factors such as the new shortened trade routes, are driving a race for influence in the Arctic and could, unfortunately, perhaps spur future conflicts. So today we have Professor Rotnem to help guide us in our understanding of what Russia and others are doing up in the Arctic. Dr. Rotnem is a professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. You have seen his very impressive background, so I won't go into great detail. But he received his PhD in political science from Ohio State University, as well as a graduate certificate as a specialist in Russian area studies. He stays very current on everything that's being said in Russia, as well as about Russia around the world. His concentrations within the political science field are in comparative politics and international political economy, with a specialization, as you might imagine, in Russian domestic and foreign politics. He has published widely papers and articles on a variety of subjects, including social welfare policies in transitioning economies, foreign direct investment in emerging economies, and the politics of oil and natural gas in resource-rich petroleum states. So you can see he has a very broad footprint. To carry on his work, Professor Rotnem has received grants and fellowships from a variety of sources, including the United States Department of State, the Department of Education, the Social Science Research Council, the International Research and Exchange Board, commonly known as IREX, the American Council for Collaboration in Education, and the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies. Beyond his teaching and research experience, Dr. Rotnem served as the president of the Georgia Political Science Association. It is the second largest statewide political science organization in the United States. Tom, it is a great pleasure to have you join us today.
Thank you, Bob. It's really great to be back with ACIR, and I want to extend congratulations for your continuing wonderful work that your program does for the Atlanta and greater metropolitan area and beyond. And I would also like to say, just extend a personal thank you for your invitation today. So today I'm going to talk about thrills, chills, and spills, as I've called it, in the Russian Arctic, recent developments in the Russian Arctic. And you'll have to excuse me for being a bit flippant with the title, but I think it's important to talk about those 3 things in this year, because the chills, obviously, or the spills, obviously refers to the great Norilsk fuel oil spill that took place this summer. The chills and the thrills might not be as apparent to people. Chills doesn't refer to the cooling in the Arctic, because of course, as I'm going to talk about in the beginning of my presentation, it's actually quite the opposite. It refers more to the COVID-19 cases that have affected Russia as a whole, but especially also in the Arctic. And then the thrills refers to military exercises, militarization in the Arctic, and a variety of other things that are kind of, as the British might say, hotting up this year. So I'm going to stop a second and share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint that I want to show you. And I'll begin by orienting everyone to the Arctic because I understand it's not the most well known area of the world, geographically speaking. So once again, I am a professor of political science and I am the associate director of the School of Government and International Affairs at KSU. And I'm really, again, happy to talk about this issue today. So first, let me orient everyone to the Arctic. The tannish areas are land masses, and these are Russia's 4,000 kilometers of borders on the Arctic Ocean, ending here up, not with Finland, but with Norway. Across the ocean is, of course, Iceland, Greenland, which is owned by Denmark, Canada, and of course, the United States. So these are two very important strategic areas for the United States, is the Bering Strait here and the so-called GI-UK gap, the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom plus Norway gap, where for potential Russian submarines coming from this area in the Kola Peninsula might emerge into the North Atlantic. Beyond military strategic matters, you might note the blue line. That refers to what Russia calls the Northern Sea Route, and I'm going to be talking about that today. The rest of the world calls it the Northeast Passage. The Northwest Passage is the green line, which goes through Canada, and above the Beaufort Sea and into the Bering Strait. And then this red line is little traversed. It's called the transpolar route. And the darkish areas are areas where there are potential oil and gas reserves. And where you see the hatch-marked areas, those are actually drilling sites. Okay, so I'm going to continue on and talk a bit about the Russian Arctic in terms of warming, as well as why Russia's interested in the Arctic. Well, this map from the NOAA tells it all. This, by the way, is the land and ocean temperature departure from the average, comparing January to April of this year to a base period from 1981 to 2010. There are some areas of the Arctic that you'll see have been cooling, but not so in the Russian Arctic whatsoever, particularly in much of the permafrost region of Russia's Arctic. So that has significant consequences for not only the globe, but also Russia's Arctic areas. For example, this is from August 2016, and you'll see the white areas are solid ice sheets from the North Pole here. Multi-year ice flows, by the way. Within just 4 short years, you can see quite a difference. Now, there has been actually greater ice in the northern Canadian areas, but less so, if I toggle back and forth, along that so-called Northern Sea Route. This area in the East Siberian Islands and the Laptev Sea in 2016, in the middle of summer, was completely ice filled. Not so in 2020. Okay, that is US data. This is Russian data, showing you pretty much the same thing. You have to reorient yourself because now we're down here in the Russian Northern Sea Route. The same thing, this goes back to 2016, and then we turn to 2020. The Northern Sea Route, which actually begins right about here, is ice-free throughout the summer of 2020. And then this is German data, which pretty much shows the same thing. So what are the consequences of this data? Very important to consider that the Arctic is actually warming overall, not only the Russian Arctic. Overall, on average, it's rating at 3 to 4 times the rate that the rest of the world is since 2000. Tremendous upsurge in warming there. The Russian Arctic, by the way, since 1960, going back 4 decades earlier, has been warming at 2.5 times the rate of the rest of the world. So it's particularly, as we saw on that first slide, it's particularly affecting the Russian areas of the high north, or the far north, as they also call it. In fact, the last 12 years were the warmest 12 years on record since Russia started taking, Rosgidromet started taking seawater measurements in 1936. So that's a dramatic change. Now, since 1979, the Arctic as a whole has lost 40% of the ice coverage throughout the region. And in fact, it's lost even more in terms of actual ice volume, which means that it's really hitting the multi-year ice as well. So water temperatures have increased about 5 degrees centigrade since the 1990s, along the Russian Arctic in particular. And you will only see single-year ice along the NSR in summers anymore. So it's really changing things. And it's predicted that the area may be completely ice-free by 2035 to 2040, somewhere in there. And that's especially because of the interaction with the albedo effect with the sea ice. Now, what is the albedo effect? The albedo effect is that radiation, sunlight, reflects off ice, and much of the heat, the radiation, goes back into the atmosphere. However, when you have such warming temperatures, you'll have melt ponds being created that don't reflect as much heat and radiation out there. And later on, I'm going to show you some of these examples of melt ponds taking place at the North Pole itself. And then, by the way, as ice coverage is less and less every year, it also increases the methane and CO2 that are being released from the deep waters. And so it's a reinforcing process there. On land in Russia, in the Yamal, the Gidan, and the Taimyr peninsulas, in the areas in the northern Siberian areas that are most important for Russian oil and gas exploration, we've seen 16 degrees centigrade increases above the normal in 2020. Really great increases. And Verkhoyansk, which is in the Yakutsk territory out in the Far East, it's one of the coldest places in the earth. And yet this summer they recorded a temperature one day of 38 degrees centigrade, which is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's extreme temperatures. So what have been the effects of this on the territory in especially the Russian, Siberian, northern, far north regions? Well, they've had a lot of forest fires. And last year they lost 2.5 million hectares of forests because of these forest fires. This year already they've lost about 600,000 hectares. And of course, you got to remember that besides the Amazon, the Siberian forests are the second lung of the world. So it's a very unfortunate thing. And then they've also had these zombie fires that have broken out all over Siberia and the far north tundra or permafrost region. Now, what is a zombie fire? It's a fire that won't go out. It's underneath the ground, and it's basically a peat fire that doesn't go out in the winter times like they normally might. And so they are continuing and adding more and more fire potential to this vast region. You've had a lot of flooding along major rivers, ocean acidification, river water acidification, and erosion along the coastal areas. And then, of course, permafrost melt. And as the permafrost melts, you'll have a lot of subsidence, which means basically the earth falls and whatever is built on top of it also does. It's a major problem in not only Russia, also in our Alaska. And then we see flora and fauna also moving northward, which could be of great significance. As we see, for example, as the permafrost warms, we have microbes that have been, in a sense, left there for a long period of time, becoming active again. And several years ago, there was a major anthrax outbreak in the Yamal Peninsula that devastated the reindeer herds up there. And we've already got about half of the reindeer in the Yamal Peninsula than they once did. Okay, so there's lots of terrestrial consequences of this. wanted to show a couple of pictures to illustrate some of the things I've talked about. This is at the North Pole. This is the Polar Stern. It's a international voyage under the Mosaic scientific organization. And at the North Pole, you don't see solid ice sheets, at least this summer. What you've seen released instead is melt ponds, which contributes to the albedo effect. And here's a map from Russian source, I believe, that shows the various areas. Each one of those red dots is a major forest fire in the Russian Arctic. And here's some zombie fires. So it's had dramatic effect over Russia's territory. It's not all bad, though, at least from the government's perspective. They believe that the Russian Arctic is their future. Developing the Russian Arctic is their future. And in fact, right now, their GDP, 11% of their gross domestic product is created from Arctic activities, Arctic economic activities. And 22% of their exports are derived from Arctic economic activities. And they just want to increase that further. So this is why Russia's current government has been, since especially about 2008, very interested in this Arctic strategy of creating more oil and especially natural gas fields in the far north. Because many of their oil and gas fields in the south of the country, in Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and elsewhere, are very mature and they're being, in a sense, played out. So they're investing in new areas on those three peninsulas there, as well as offshore. They're also interested in creating the Northern Sea Route as an alternative to a global shipping route that tends to go through the Straits of Malacca, into the Suez Canal, and then up through the Mediterranean Sea in the North Atlantic. They've also moved towards militarizing the Arctic too. From their perspective, they have three rationales for building back this military capacity. One is to protect the large investments, billions of rubles and dollars going into the Northern Sea Route and these oil gas fields, new infrastructure, and so on. Also, the militarization is there to help protect their claims to various Arctic resources and their sovereignty over those areas. And lastly, with warming, their northern wall, if you will, their fourth directional area is now much more vulnerable to various outside forces, as particularly shipping. So they want to protect that with some military outposts. So it's really, from their perspective, a defensive strategy. But other people see this as an offensive potentiality into the future. Now, what have they done most recently in the last 2 years? For one, in May 1st, 2018, President Putin delivered 24 directives, or ukazi, in which a few of them were directed on the Northern Sea Route. Also, the State Atomic Energy Agency was given control over the entire Northern Sea Route. As well, they unveiled this year 2035 Arctic strategy till 2035. It's very important because it really develops all kinds of new measures to be taken by them and their government into the future there. For example, a slew of new enabling legislative frameworks have been developed and are being developed, which is going to create a special economic zone all along the northern shore of Russia. And they've given preferential investment to create opportunities for foreign investment, not only Chinese, also South Korean perhaps. They're directing their attention to Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Japan, and West as well, if we didn't have the sanctions regime, and also creating public-private partnerships. And then most recently, this summer, they merged the Arkhangelsk and the Nenets regions into one. And lastly, they created a Arctic ministry, you could say, Minvostok Razvitya, which is in charge of the Far East as well as the Arctic. And the head of that is a very powerful individual in Russia. He has three portfolios. He's kind of the head of the presidential administration for the Far East. He's the minister of this new ministry, and he's also a deputy prime minister. And so they are moving very quickly and forward on this. Okay, again, why are they interested? Because of the Arctic oil and gas possibilities in the Arctic. As this United States Geological Survey map of 2008 refers, there's a lot of oil and gas here and in the East Barents Basin as well, as there are to the west and east of Greenland and elsewhere. And you'll also note that those regions I've kind of highlighted here with the level of natural gas that's there. It dwarfs pretty much any other area except perhaps the Alaska Basin. Same goes for oil equivalents. And there's also other natural gas liquids, methane, plenty of that if we ever decided, if they ever decided, or the world ever decided to develop methane on a commercial basis. Okay, so one of the major Russian LNG projects, which is operative right now, is the Yamal LNG plant. And this is the Yamal Peninsula. This is a little bit incorrect. It actually should be here, but that's okay. This is Gidan Peninsula, and this is the Taimyr Peninsula. Since I've mentioned that, I wanted to mention Yamal, Gidan, and Taimyr. This is the area of most oil and gas exploration these days. This is where it's all happening, and the Yamal LNG plant is the first of many plants that are being built. And in the summer, they're going to, and they are, developing routes along the Northern Sea Route to export with 15 ice-class LNG tankers to go to Asia, and in the winter to the Western Europe. By the way, that's 30% owned by the Chinese government and 20% owned by the French, the Russian government, and Novatek and Gazprom owns the controlling shares. There are other areas too. Arctic LNG is another Novatek plant in the Gidan Peninsula here. And they are developing transshipment ports. Right now, out west, they have to rely upon a LNG transshipment facility in Norway, and they prefer to build one themselves, and so they are building one at Bela Kamenka here. And they're building one out in Kamchatka as well. Plus, they are building two other LNG plants, besides the Arctic LNG plants, the Gidan plant and the Ob plant. That's all under construction or in plans right now. As well, offshore, Gazprom has made some rather large natural gas finds at the Articheskaya gas field and the Kameno-Miskaya gas field as well. So these are all in development stages. When it comes to oil, a huge new oil plant is oil production facility is being built by Rotnem, chaired by Igor Sechin, a very close ally of President Putin. And it's going to be including significant mileage in pipelines. They're going to have 50 ice-class tankers. A new terminal is going to be built right about here to connect up to the Northern Sea Route, and it's going to create 100,000 new jobs. So that's their plans in terms of oil and gas development. What about the Northern Sea Route? As you can see, the blue route is the Northern Sea Route, and it's much shorter than the usual route, say from South Korea to Rotterdam. It's important for the government because in that one of those directives that Putin laid down back in 2018, he said he wants to see 80 million tons of volume going through the Northern Sea Route by 2024. Also, he hopes that thereafter, the route will even expand even more so and displace more of the freight that goes through the Suez and the Malacca route. It's much shorter. Again, it's more fuel efficient. There are some problems with it, but it's more cost efficient as well. And so what they're doing there is upgrading old ports. They are creating some brand new ports, Novi Port, for example. They are giving Rosatom a significant increase in government funding for the development of lots of things in the Northern Sea Route. They also are installing a whole communication network along it and building a bigger icebreaker fleet. Right now, they have the world's largest icebreaker fleet at 42 icebreakers. The United States has one. Okay, and there's some more that are coming their way. Project 22220 is a new huge 170, they have a twin 170 megawatt reactors. They're nuclear icebreakers, and there's 5 coming down the road that can break 9 feet of ice. Arctica, they've suffered some delays, but Arctica, the first of them pictured here, is set to begin work in 2020. In 2027, there's going to be having their last one. That same year, they're also going to be introducing a new next generation leader class, which is going to have 2 twin 400 megawatt reactors, and they're going to be able to break 13 feet of ice. And that is a very big improvement upon the ones that are in existence right now. Okay, and that is a artist's rendition of what it's going to look like, the leader class fleet. So along the Northern Sea Route, you have seen volumes increase. Before 2017, it may have been half as much any given year. So that signaled a great increase. It doubled or almost doubled in 2018, significant increase in 2019. And despite the pandemic, it's also up about 3% over 2019 figures this year. The plan again is 80 million tons along the Northern Sea Route by 2024. And the CEO of the largest, essentially private gas company, Leonid Mikhelson, claims that his company alone that runs Yamal will be delivering 70 million tons along the Northern Sea Route by 2030. So this is a future for Russia's and perhaps the world's shipping. Okay, other infrastructure projects. They're building this, gas pipeline from the Sabeta area, Bovanenskova actually, to Ukhta, and then connecting up to the Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1 facilities supplying Western Europe and Germany. They're also building a very expensive railway to connect this with the Sabeta port. They're also building a railway, or have plans to build a railway, the Belcamur Railway, which connects up the Bieli Sea, the White Sea, with the Komi Republic right here, and along to the Urals. That's where they get the term Belcamur. And that is going to be an extension of the Belt and Road initiative that they have with China to ferret products, not so much along the Northern Sea Route, but also through Russia and out to export that way. Now, let me get to the teaser, I guess you'd call it, of my talk, which is the thrills, chills, and spills. The chills, again, sorry for the flippancy with regard to that, but it's taken a toll, coronavirus, on the economy. The total caseload as of yesterday in Russia was almost 1 million. And the deaths was about 16,500, which is a rate of about 1.7%. So perhaps a little bit better than what we're doing in the United States, but one can always say whether those figures may be different from reality. Also, the most large cities were affected in the beginning, Moscow and St. Petersburg, especially Moscow, but also the far northern regions. This is a picture taken early on of Russia's coronavirus extent in a regional map in the end of March 2020. You can see in the far north, there wasn't much going on in the area of coronavirus infections. However, as of August, the picture has changed a bit. Moscow is still a hot spot, but so are places in the far north, all these areas. And many of the hot spots are Murmansk, particularly at Belokamenka. I mentioned that before. Workers are being infected with this. At the Arkhangelsk naval yards near Severodvinsk, and many of the submarines that are manufactured by Russia are being built there, and they're being affected by that. And this is not too far from that test site there, and they had that explosion last August that you may remember. And then in the Yamal area, particularly at the Nova Urengoi fields and in Sabeta, significant hotspots of new coronavirus infections. And that has had an impact upon the projects because you have itinerant workers coming in for 3-4 weeks and then going back to where they came from in southern parts of Russia and bringing back them with them in close proximity with others, the coronavirus. So there have been problems with that, which have delayed projects. And they've also had transport problems, PPE problems, just as the United States had initially. And this coronavirus is having an effect beyond that on Putin's poll ratings. They've been dented significantly. And also surveys recently have shown that the Russian public are not too happy with the state of their healthcare system. For example, it's known that in outlying areas, there could be as many as 40% of hospitals or clinics that don't have heating, and maybe even a larger percentage that don't have running water. And so it's kind of become known, a lot of the decrepit situation with the Russian healthcare system. And now you have only 13% of Russians arguing that they have strong confidence or confidence in the Russian healthcare system. And that plays into Putin's approval ratings because he seemed to be distancing himself from the coronavirus issue altogether. Spills. Of course, this breakneck development in the north, without much supervision from the Russian Federal Natural Resource Ministry, at the same time that you had a lot of permafrost melt, you have spills like this. And the darkish areas at the bottom of this Ambarnaya River in Taimyr Peninsula is the fuel oil that leaked into the river for 2 to 3 days. The Russian government found out about these spills from social media, not from the company of Nornickel, nor did they find out from local government organizations or even Rosprirodnadzor. So you had as a total about 21,000 tons of fuel oil flowing into and despoiling the Ambarnaya River basin, which is, by the way, about 60% of the size of the Exxon Valdez back in the late 80s. So at least now they're talking it's going to be at least $2 billion to clean it up. And again, what was the cause of this? Some of it was negligence on the part of Nornickel, but it was also the fact of permafrost melting because the reservoir, the tank that held all this fuel, on the ground upon which it stood, subsided, and the supports for it broke open the tank. And this is a major problem for Russia's future because it already has about 10,000 spills per year in its oil and gas industry. And the Norilsk reservoir that broke is just a tiny fraction of the Russian oil and diesel fuel that's held in these type of tundra reservoirs that are experiencing a lot of permafrost melting. And by the way, in Russia, permafrost makes up about 65% of the country. Melting of permafrost is also important because when you have such ancient lands, if you will, that were frozen for millennia, now being opened up to warming and becoming exposed to the elements, you will have deciduous tree matter, what have you, now decaying and creating more carbon release and methane as well, which reinforces, again, this heating cycle. Okay, what about the thrills? There's been plenty of activity in the Russian Arctic in terms of training exercises, not only on their side, but also on our side. Also in terms of development of new infrastructure, positioning of and deployment of new weapon systems, and activity in general there. Yet Russia, it should be noted from the first start, has a long history of cooperation in the Arctic with other Arctic powers. Bob mentioned those others. The other 7 members of the Arctic Council, its neighbors in the Arctic. It was a founding Arctic Council member in the mid-90s. It also is a signatory of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States isn't even a signatory of that convention. And it's submitted its territorial claims, undersea territorial claims, to the United Nations to decide what's going to happen. So that shows kind of a cooperative perspective on their part. They also delimited the Barents Sea boundary between themselves and Norway in 2010. They have had an active role in many international maritime organizations, as well as Arctic Council agreements. For example, on maritime search and rescue, scientific cooperation, the Central Arctic Fisheries Agreement, the Oil Pollution and Response Agreement, as well as signing the Polar Code, which is important to note. At the same time, they have been very active in the far north. They've set up new radar stations. 5 of these are the newest resonance radar station. that has an ability to see 600 kilometers and even more for ballistic missiles. They've set up two motorized military brigades of about 10,000 men each, one in the Yamal Peninsula and one over here near the Kola Peninsula. They also have opened up or rejuvenated 14 military air bases, including the world's most northernmost air base at Nagurskaya, which houses MiG-31s and Sukhoi 24 attack interceptors and bombers, as well as over here at Stredny, at Cape Schmidt, and at Wrangel Island here. They are developing new ones. These are opening most recently. This is a rather old map, maybe 1 or 2 years old, but these are all going to be opened up very soon. So they've got 14 new bases there. They've got 40 new surface ships. They've got new drones that they've developed for Arctic climate conditions. They've set up communication networks to better allow their Navy and Air Force to contact one another, and also creating a trans-Arctic fiber optic cable to unite communications better there as well. So they're doing a lot there. And again, it's important to note their reasoning. Many of these things are to be used not only for offensive capability, but also for dual use missions of not only defense, but also search and rescue, helping out scientific research. If you had to respond to a big oil spill, who do you send in? The military. First off, when we had the Ebola crisis in the world in West Africa, we didn't send the CDC, we sent the US Army. So that, they claim, is one of their reasons, dual use capabilities. Also, as I mentioned before, protection and construction of their economic assets and the shipping lanes, the sovereignty over the shipping lanes. And they are worried about trafficking possibilities, drugs, human trafficking, as well as terrorism. The FSB, the Russian Foreign Service Agency, Foreign Intelligence Agency, is very worried about that, especially at Yamal. They've already caught some people engaged in nefarious activities there. And also reestablishing the capacity that they lost in the 1990s in a region that they see is now more vulnerable. So these are what they claim. Of course, these are all defensive claims. We claim that there's something perhaps more nefarious there. Maybe there's an offensive potentiality, and we're especially concerned about it now that China is more interested in taking an active role in the Arctic with their issuing of a white paper in January of 2018 on their Arctic policy themselves. Okay, cautionary tale though, we'll close out this screen and this lecture, is just that we got a lot of stepped up exercises on both sides. The United States has just this summer had B-52 flights and ship excursions, exercises in the Barents Sea that they haven't had since the 1980s. And the same goes for Russia, up with bombers approaching the Alaskan landmass. But these are happening, and we're getting the close proximity, particularly in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, not as much in the Arctic area, but at a time when there are very few military to military contacts between the two countries. And my recommendations as I go to questions here is we need to get the Russian partner or potential partner back to the Arctic Security Roundtable. It's probably very unlikely that they will, at this point, attend NATO gatherings. But the Arctic Security Roundtable is one which we had them maintaining regular relationship with, where our military officials will understand more what they're planning in the Arctic. We invite China, but since Ukraine, we haven't invited them to that thing, as you might expect. Also, we need to get them involved perhaps on new issue areas in the far north. For example, maybe an agreement could be made on marine plastics in the Arctic. It's a very devastating, it's a pristine nature area of the world. And perhaps we need to talk a bit with them a bit more about more environmental type adaptation exercises that we can use toward the north for functionalist purposes. That is, maybe this activity, this cooperation would spill over into other areas. And then lastly, we need to take advantage of the fact that Russia is going to be chairing the Arctic Council next fall in 2021, 2023. Putin wants to be seen as a success during that era, during that chairmanship. And why? Because they're not taken seriously, they think, in many other venues in the world. Here's an area where they are a stakeholder, a major force in the Arctic, and they want to see success of that 2-year period where they chair and direct the agenda of the Arctic Council. And so perhaps that's some leverage for the United States to use to create better opportunities for collaboration, cooperation in the Arctic. Maybe being able to even ring fence the Arctic from some of the more negative problems that we have with Russia. So I'll close there and take questions. Tony?
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Rotnem. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to remind you that our audience that will take your questions in the order in which they're received. In the interest of time, please keep them as succinct as possible. And also, please be aware that we often receive questions in advance of the program. And as in the past programs, I'll be inserting them from time to time to lend balance to the question stream. First question, Dr. Rotnem. While Russia is spending billions of rubles in the Arctic region to consolidate its maritime status, what is the condition of its infrastructure within the interior of Greater Russia?
That's a good question. One of those, more than one of those directives that Putin talked about in May 1st of 2018 actually directed the Russian government's attention towards developing more for the infrastructure of the country, not only in the Arctic. And so they're spending a lot of money on there. If you've traveled to Russia in maybe the last few years compared with the 1990s or the first 2 terms of Putin in 2000 to 2008, you'd seen a dramatic difference in the infrastructure, highways, new motorways, and train infrastructural improvements in other parts of Russia, not in the rural areas. The rural areas are still fairly typically poor in service from that perspective. But they've had a lot of new airport upgrades, particularly in the major cities, particularly in advance of the Olympics in Sochi, and of course the World Cup in 2018, and other lesser events that they've hosted. So they are making headway on that road, but they've got a way to go. But unfortunately, not only has COVID-19 hurt them poorly, and a lot of the plans for these ukazi, these directives, are having to be scaled back as they shift monies towards, to PPE, towards healthcare system, and towards other important matters. You've also had a declining economy as the oil price, as the gas prices go down as well. That's a double stymie on their development of directing funds towards infrastructural improvements.
The success of Russia's continental shelf claim is paramount for relief of a failing economic system. If the claim is denied, what are the options that Russia faces? And if denial becomes a reality, in your judgment, what option may the current leader pursue?
Well, they've had claims at the Commission on the CLCS underneath the UN auspices since 2001. They were told sometime in the aught period that their claims weren't sufficient. So they had to go out and do more scientific gathering of data. And they did that, and they resubmitted that information in 2015, 2016, and we still haven't heard the results of all of that. The important thing to remember is the CLCS really doesn't ever issue guidelines on claims and rulings on claims unless the parties to the conflict, and with regard to Russia, they have overlapping claims with Denmark, which owns Greenland, and with Canada, particularly over the Lomonosov Ridge. I have a map that shows that if anyone's interested. They haven't in the past issued a ruling unless those countries come to some kind of agreement. Otherwise, those rulings aren't made. And it's probably unlikely that the CLCS will act on them and deliver a negative ruling unless Russia takes a very obstreperous position with regard to those claims, and Canada and Denmark. But from what I've read about it from Western sources, they're trying to meet those countries halfway over those claims. So it's a good question. I don't believe at this point in time they would consider using any type of military force to take over those areas. I think they have a pretty good claim from what I've read, science, Western scientists say about this natural prolongation, as it is under the UNCLOS, that they have from their continental shelf that makes their claim go way out into the Arctic Ocean.
It does.
But we'll have to wait and see. I don't anticipate the ruling for several years. I think those countries that I've mentioned are very willing to meet and to resolve this issue. A couple years ago, that wasn't the case because from what I've read, Denmark and Canada especially were unwilling to meet the Russians about it because of the fallout from Ukraine and because of urging on the part of the United States to not be so cooperative with the Russians. I've read that in several places. I don't know if it's actually true, but that's something to consider. They are talking now, though.
I regret asking you if you could just micro-encapsulate your responses just a wee bit.
Oh, sure.
You are a tanker full of answers for each of these minuscule questions, and we're beginning to run out of time. So please forgive the request.
No problem.
Are American petroleum companies such as ExxonMobil continuing to engage in technological assistance to Russian companies such as Gazprom in spite of American sanctions?
That's an interesting question because just this summer, Exxon pulled out an agreement to be involved in fossil fuel production with Russians. So I would say that perhaps they were evading sanctions in some regards, because as you know, the sanctions were to be directed at hurting Russia where they thought it would hurt them the most in their Arctic plans. And of course, they were brilliantly focused on that, and it did have a great effect. However, it had no impact on Russia's behavior from our perspective. So whether the sanctions were ultimately effective or not was another thing. But perhaps, you can always, legal analysis of any issue can always find opportunities for involvement on the other side of an issue. So I would not say that Exxon was doing anything illegal by helping them. But they have pulled out of that most recent cooperation with Russia.
Given the Arctic's hostile environment, how realistic is it to assume that Russia can acquire economic benefits without Western technological assistance and its reliance on Chinese loans?
Yeah, that's a major concern. But Russia's, the sanctions have done some things good, Russian perspective, in that they've had to become kind of import substitutors. And their technology might not be as good, but they're forced to develop that. We saw that also in the consumer goods industry. After all the milk products that they could no longer get from Western Europe, there's been a renaissance of that in Russia's industry, domestic industry, and that may be having some effect too. But it's also the fact that they are using Chinese technology, and China, of course, is not really, well, in some sense, it's unable to transfer that technology to Russia, but China is very much so helping Russia with drilling in the Arctic. So some of that technology that China gets in certain other projects may be finding its way to help Russia in the far north.
We have time. I have a good half dozen more questions for you, but I regret saying this may be the last one. Let's see if you can knock this one out of the park. Maybe we can squeeze one more in before I lateral to Dr. Kennedy. The Baltic region is close to the Arctic. If an outbreak of hostilities occurred somewhere in the Baltic, does Putin's past behavior suggest he would allow it to bleed into the Arctic? Or in your judgment, would he remain sufficiently pragmatic and maintain a non-provocative stance in the Arctic?
So if a NATO action occurred in the Baltic states region, or if there's some kind of activity in the Baltic state, would it remain localized? That's a good question. I don't really have an answer for that. I would say that I don't foresee that happening. Russia completely understands that NATO is a force to be reckoned with. Now they have not good relations with NATO these days, but NATO outnumbers Russia in so many different categories, economically speaking. I don't think that Russia would do anything untoward to NATO because of Article 5, and attack against one area is attack against them all. That being said, Russia has a lot of assets in the far north. The 2/3 of their nuclear deployments are on submarines in the far north, around the Kola Peninsula, Murmansk, and those areas. So that's an area not too far away from the Baltics, but I don't foresee anything happening or connecting those two areas.
Yeah, interestingly, just very recently, based upon some Russian military activities up there that got Norway nervous, we sent 6 B-52s overland on the way to England, and 1 American Seawolf, which it was in Tromsø, Norway. I think they were there for a little while. And the significance of that, of course, is that the Seawolf is designed for nothing but to go after Russian submarines underneath the Russian ice flow. Thought I'd throw that in for
Yes, I did
what it's
see
worth.
that development. Yes. It was
Yeah. Okay, so we have time. Here's your greatest challenge of all, Dr. Rotnem. A 2-minute response, if less. And I selected this one purposefully because I think it aids to that. As Greenpeace and other related environmental groups continued its protests of Russian oil drilling in the Arctic in spite of vessels seized dating back to 2013. Do you have any information to that effect?
No, I don't really know if there's much activity there. I haven't seen anything for the last several years. Just Greenpeace itself, they have their own chapter of the Greenpeace movement. They're active, but in a autocratic system, there's only so much that can be done. And so, unfortunately, the decision makers in Russia have decided they're going to develop the far north. They can bring a lot of the population along because of the fact that it offers such promise for economic development and resources and continued budget growth and pensions being kept up to a certain level. But there is a strong feeling amongst Russians that they need to be more careful about how they develop the North. And I think the chairmanship of the Arctic Council might be an opportunity for the world to put some pressure on Russia to make sure that their economic development doesn't come at the cost of the environment. And that's a very important time to do that, again, because they want to see a success there. And one of the main goals of the Russian, they haven't revealed them until about October of this year, but reportedly one of the main goals of their chairmanship will be economic development in the far north. So this is a time for the other 7 members, plus all the permanent observers, like China. I'm surprised I didn't get a question about China, to put pressure on Russia to maybe develop environmentally soundly.
Yeah, I'm terribly sorry. We have run out of time, and there's no question if there are any issues about Russia, you're the man. I'm now going to lateral to Dr. Kennedy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Tom, thank you so much for such a valuable insight into particularly what the Russians are doing up in the Arctic, their interest in and developments in the Arctic, as well as what we might consider some unfortunate and disturbing militarization. Also, thanks for so much for underscoring the importance of discussions and dialogue as a way of possibly avoiding these potential future conflicts and finding accommodations that actually work for all of us. I was very interested in your comments about the permafrost because a few years back, I've traveled extensively in Russia. And a few years back, I was up in Yakutsk. It's perhaps the only major city built on permafrost. And this was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And you can see the effects of the melting, not only in the permafrost, but also the ground. As the permafrost retreats, the waters on the surface retreat, the rivers dry up. Shortly after that, I was in Mongolia. They've had over 2,000 rivers that have dried in Mongolia as of about 8 years ago. So I have no idea what's going on there. But you're absolutely right. We're seeing an opportunity as well as some potential dangers as we see the ice melt in the Arctic. And we're so delighted that you were able to join us today to help us better understand all of those factors. For those of you who have joined us also today, for your safety and health and the health of others, please continue to wear your masks and exercise social distancing. This is so important for our recovery, not only here in Georgia, but we travel all over the country. And so for those that you encounter, you're keeping them safe also. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
We wish you good health and great happiness from Atlanta and ACIR. Good afternoon.